The sun was setting over Santa Barbara, casting long amber fingers across the glimmering windows of the Langston estate. Perched high on a coastal bluff, the mansion looked like something out of a dream, Italianate arches, marble balustrades, and manicured gardens that flowed like green silk toward the ocean. It was the kind of place where fairy tales were meant to unfold, where happy endings should have bloomed like the white roses lining the drive. But inside the estate, in a master bedroom designed with more grandeur than warmth, Naomi Carter stood before a full-length mirror and fastened a sapphire earring with trembling hands. Her reflection was stunning, and yet she couldn't recognize the woman looking back. The silk gown hugged her curves with precision, a designer's vision of elegance. Her skin glowed under golden lighting, her curls had been pinned into a chignon that exposed the graceful line of her neck. To the outside world, she was Naomi Langston, wife of Richard Langston, beloved philanthropist, and heir to one of California's oldest textile dynasties. But to herself, she was a woman who had slowly, quietly been erased. "You're late," came Richard's voice from behind her, sharp, polished, rehearsed. Naomi flinched slightly, then turned. He stood at the threshold in his tailored tuxedo jaw, tight eyes, cold. To the cameras tonight, he'd be the perfect husband, gracious, witty, a progressive white businessman who had elevated his black wife into high society. But in private, he was a man who prized control more than companionship, legacy more than love. "I had to finish setting the silent auction items for the Education Foundation," she said softly. "You asked me to. I asked you to be ready by 6, he snapped, stepping into the room and adjusting his cufflinks with a flick of irritation. "You're not here to work, Naomi. You're here to stand beside me and look like someone worth investing in." His words were as precise as his grooming, each syllable designed to cut. Naomi looked down her stomach, nodding. Her grandmother's voice, soft and honeyed, rose from a distant memory. Baby girl beauty means nothing if it's bought with silence. But silence had become Naomi's refuge. She had once believed in the romance of Richard's proposal, how he had swept into her life during her senior year at Howard, praising her intelligence, her dreams of teaching inner-city children her love of literature. He had promised to support her ambitions. But promises have a way of evaporating beneath power. Once the marriage papers were signed, her graduate school acceptance letter mysteriously never arrived. The teaching offer at her neighborhood school was rescinded. Her stepmother, who had so enthusiastically encouraged the match, moved into a luxury condo paid for by the Langston Family Trust. And Naomi was left to play a part in a performance she had never auditioned for. As they drove toward the gala that night, the lights of Santa Barbara sparkled like diamonds beneath the hills. Naomi stared out the window, watching the ocean blur in streaks of silver and black. "Tonight is critical," Richard said. "The Warner family will be there. They're considering an endowment. Don't talk politics, don't mention your background, and for God's sake, don't bring up poetry." She said nothing. The sapphire necklace at her throat, his latest apology, felt more like a collar. At the gala, Naomi smiled on cue. She sipped champagne, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and nodded politely as donors discussed legacy and capital gains. Inside, her spirit shrank a little more. But something changed when she stepped out onto the balcony for a moment's breath. The evening air was cool, laced with salt and jasmine. Naomi leaned against the railing and tilted her face toward the stars. For a moment, the mask slipped. She wasn't Mrs. Langston. She was just Naomi, daughter of a librarian, lover of books and music, a girl who used to write poems by candlelight in her grandmother's apartment. She closed her eyes, whispering, "There has to be more than this." She didn't know that across the ballroom someone had been watching her. Not the way Richard watched, to monitor, to judge, but with a quiet reverence. A man with silver-streaked hair, a black tuxedo, and eyes that carried the kind of grief only felt by those who have lost something too beautiful to name. Elliot, Grant tech magnate turned recluse, had attended the gala at the last minute on the request of a friend. He hated these events. But when he saw Naomi on that balcony, so luminous, so quietly aching, something inside him stirred. She didn't know it yet, but tonight had planted a seed that would shatter the walls of her prison. And somewhere far inside her, hope stirred. If this story has already touched your heart, let it linger. Leave a comment, even a simple heart, so we know you're here with us. Don't forget to like and follow for the next chapter. This is only the beginning. The morning light filtered through gauzy curtains, casting golden threads across the cold, empty side of Naomi's bed. The Langston estate, with its echoing hallways and cathedral ceilings, was always quietest just after sunrise, before staff bustled through with silver trays and polish, before Richard's voice filled the air with instructions and demands. Naomi sat on the edge of the mattress, one hand resting over the smooth silk of her lap, the other absently tracing the faint bruise on her wrist. It had faded to the soft gray of forgotten thunder, but her body remembered. It always did. She was supposed to review the guest list for that evening's donor brunch, select a dress from the options laid out by her stylist, and pretend yet again that everything in her world was pristine, enviable, whole. Instead, she stood and walked barefoot to the small, rarely used library at the far end of the East Wing. This room was hers. Richard never entered it. Perhaps it was the books, hundreds of them, dusty with neglect, filled with truths no society gala ever dared speak. She traced her fingers over a cloth-bound anthology of Maya Angelou and pulled it gently from the shelf. Inside, tucked between the pages of "And Still I Rise," was a single white rose. Her breath caught. It wasn't from the floral arrangements. Those were meticulously placed, uniform sterile. This was something else entirely wild, delicate, personal. Beside the rose was a slip of cream paper, embossed with nothing but a quote in flowing script. "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." She looked around. The room was empty, silent, still, and yet something had shifted. That evening, when Richard left for a business dinner alone, furious, she dared question the charitable optics of a company on the verge of layoffs. Naomi wandered into the music room. Her fingertips grazed the ivory keys of the grand piano she hadn't touched in years. Her grandmother had taught her to play. Once Naomi had dreamed of teaching children to read music, to express what the world would not let them say. There, waiting on the bench, was another rose, another card. Some souls were never meant to be caged. Her heart thundered, not with fear, but with recognition. Someone saw her. Not the polished wife, not the obedient ornament. Her. She found the third one 2 days later, nestled in the pocket of her wool coat just before stepping into the car for the winter benefit luncheon. This time the card read, "You are not invisible. You never were." Naomi clutched the message in her hand for the entire ride, staring out the window, while Richard praised himself in the seat beside her, oblivious. She didn't know who was sending them. There were dozens of people in the house, maids, drivers, cooks, groundskeepers. But none of them had ever broken the strict hierarchy Richard enforced like gospel. Then a week later he arrived, the new household manager, hired by Richard through some agency specializing in European staff, vetted, approved, and expected to maintain order. He was tall, with ash blonde hair and slate gray eyes. His posture was refined, his voice low, calm. His name, Eli Morgan. He spoke with a trace of old-world formality, but there was something distinctly American in the way he carried himself, as though the Polish were just a second skin. Naomi noticed him first when he corrected the lighting for the foyer art wall, without being asked. Then when he had fresh chamomile waiting in the kitchen after her monthly board meeting. Then again when he intercepted Richard's rage one morning, with a seamless intervention, refilling his coffee with a quiet efficiency that shifted the storm without a word. But it wasn't until the fourth rose that she began to suspect. She'd found it placed in the corner of the nursery room, empty, unused, a room she had once decorated in secret after a false positive on a pregnancy test nearly 2 years earlier. She'd never told anyone, never spoke of it aloud. And yet the card resting beside the rose said, "The future waits patiently for the moment you believe you deserve it." That night, after Richard had passed out in his study, she walked through the darkened house barefoot, following the instinct that had been blooming quietly in her chest. She found Eli in the conservatory. He was adjusting the humidity for the orchids, his movements precise and reverent. When he turned, he did not look surprised to see her. "The phalaenopsis were struggling," he said softly. "A few degrees too high, and they close too early. Too cold, and the petals drop before they bloom. "You know about orchids?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "My grandmother grew them." Naomi stepped closer, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Was it you?" He paused, his eyes met hers, steady, unafraid. "Yes." The silence stretched between them. It was not awkward, it was sacred. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk your position, your safety?" Eli studied her for a long moment, then said, "Because someone needed to remind you that your spirit still exists, that you are not alone in that house no matter how much they try to make you believe otherwise." She swallowed hard. Emotion rose in her throat like floodwater. No one had spoken to her like that in years, perhaps ever. "Naomi," he said, her name sounding almost like a vow in his mouth. "You deserve gentleness, not as reward, but as your right." She didn't know what to say. She only knew that something inside her had been waiting, aching for these words. And in that moment, standing in the soft glow of the orchid lamps among blooming things that had nearly withered from neglect, she felt the first whisper of something new. Not love, not yet, but the breathtaking possibility of it. A stranger had stepped into her world, but he saw her. And somehow, impossibly, he made her believe that she might still be whole, and perhaps not alone. The house had changed. It was subtle, imperceptible perhaps to Richard or the staff who moved like shadows through the estate. But Naomi felt it. The air no longer carried the sterile weight of emptiness. Something warm had begun to slip through the cracks in the marble walls, curling into corners where sunlight used to feel lonely. And everywhere she turned, there were signs of him. She would find a book, one she'd once mentioned in passing, placed neatly on the windowsill of the music room, a paper rose folded into its final chapter. Her favorite tea, a rare lavender blend from the south of France she hadn't tasted since college, now waited for her some mornings on the breakfast tray. The temperature in her private study always seemed just right. The music in the hallway softened to the exact piano pieces she loved most. Debussy, sometimes Chopin, playing as though the house itself had remembered who she used to be. And always there were roses. White ones, delicate, fragrant, and never left in plain view, always tucked somewhere meaningful. Inside her grandmother's old journal, on the cushion of the reading nook where she escaped to breathe, pressed between the pages of Maya Angelou and Gwendolyn Brooks. One even appeared atop her pillow after a night when Richard's cruelty had left her too broken to rise. She never asked how Eli knew. Some part of her already did. The quiet strength in his gaze when they passed in the hallway told her everything his role as house manager would never permit. He was always formal, appropriate, but in the slant of his smile and the brief flicker of warmth in his gray eyes, Naomi felt acknowledged. Not as a role, not as an ornament or a possession, but as a human being. One evening, as she sat alone at the piano, her fingers wandering over keys she hadn't dared play for years, she felt the music return to her, hesitant, trembling, but real. The melody was imperfect, but she did not stop. And when the final note faded, she noticed a slip of parchment resting on the ledge. "You haven't lost your voice." It was only waiting for a place safe enough to speak again. She pressed it to her chest, breath catching in her throat. The tears came silently, grief, relief, gratitude, all pouring through a wound she'd kept stitched shut too long. He saw her, even when she didn't want to be seen, especially then. One morning, Richard found a single rose near the hallway staircase. Naomi had already seen it, had already tucked it gently into the pages of a book before her husband arrived. But Richard, ever the predator scanning for disorder, noticed the absence of uniformity. "Who put that there?" he snapped at the nearest maid. "We're not running a goddamn wedding chapel." Naomi braced herself. When no one answered fast enough, he turned on her. "You've been encouraging the help again, haven't you? Smiling too much? Thanking them? I see the way you look at that new one. What's his name, Eli?" Naomi said nothing. Silence had long become her defense. But inside her heart rattled with something dangerously close to fear. "I'll be watching him," Richard muttered, tossing the morning paper at her feet. "Don't make me regret keeping you in this house." Later that day, when she knelt to retrieve the paper from the Persian rug, she found another rose. Not from Eli this time, but from herself. She had placed it there instinctively like armor. a small act of rebellion, a whisper to herself that she was still alive. That afternoon, she sought Eli. She told herself it was only to thank him for ordering the antique French tea service she'd once admired in a magazine. But when she found him in the conservatory tending the orchids like sacred relics, her voice shook with something more urgent. The roses, the tea, the books. Why are you doing these things? He turned to her slowly, his sleeves rolled up a speck of soil on his knuckles. Because beauty should not be reserved only for the powerful, he said softly. And because I know what it means to feel unseen. She hesitated, then took a step closer. You risk more than you should, she whispered. You know that, don't you? I do. His voice was calm, but she saw it then. Beneath the restraint, the polish, there was a fire. Controlled, yes, but fierce. And she understood with breathtaking clarity that Eli wasn't here simply to serve. He was here to protect, to witness. Eli, she said, then paused. This isn't part of your job. No, he agreed, his voice low. It's not. Their eyes met across the ferns and the violets. Something passed between them, silent but undeniable. Not romance, not yet. Something earlier, truer. Recognition. He was the first person since her grandmother who made her feel like she wasn't invisible, and that she realized was more dangerous than any bruise, more powerful than any secret. She stepped away first, back into the hallway, back into the role. But her fingers brushed his arm as she passed just enough to say, I see you too. And that night, for the first time in years, Naomi fell asleep, not dreading the next day, but wondering what it might bring. There was music again in her life, even if faint. There was breath, and there were white roses blooming gently in the dark. The wind that day carried the scent of salt and fire. The Santa Ana winds had come early, stirring dry leaves into frenzied dances across the marble patio, rattling window panes with the urgency of a storm not quite seen, but deeply felt. Inside the Langston estate, however, the storm was already alive in words and tension, in a marriage slowly turning to ash. Naomi stood at the dining room table setting place cards for the quarterly investor brunch. Her hands were steady trained, every gesture elegant. But her mind was elsewhere, still lingering in the conservatory, still hearing Eli's voice like music she hadn't realized she missed. He hadn't spoken to her since that moment 2 days earlier. He hadn't needed to. The space between them had become a language of its own. Richard entered the room with his usual air of disapproval, his cufflinks glinting like warning signs. He was already angry, though nothing had happened yet to justify it. Sometimes she suspected rage was simply his way of feeling alive. I just got off the phone with the board, he snapped, slamming his phone onto the table. If that university grant doesn't go through, I'll have to liquidate another asset. Maybe this estate. Naomi didn't answer. She had long ago learned that Richard didn't want conversation, he wanted compliance. But today, something in her refused to stay quiet. You could try speaking to the donors with more honesty, she said gently. Transparency goes further than flash. Richard's head turned slowly, his expression hardening. Don't lecture me about business. You're here to smile, Naomi. To look pretty and keep your mouth shut. That's the agreement. Naomi lifted her chin. That was never the agreement. He stepped forward fast. The slap wasn't as loud as it had been the first time he struck her months ago, but it echoed all the same. Her cheeks stung, her ears rang, and her body froze as the sting spread through her bones. And then everything changed. Because she didn't cry, she didn't retreat. She just looked at him, with eyes not filled with fear but with clarity, with decision. At that moment, a faint gasp broke the silence from the far end of the room. A maid stood there frozen, and beside her, unnoticed until now, was Eli. His hands clenched at his sides, jaw locked. He didn't move. Not yet. But Naomi saw it, the fury restrained only by the walls between them, the silent promise in his eyes that this was the last time anyone would lay a hand on her again. Richard, noticing the eyes now fixed on him, scoffed and adjusted his sleeve. She provoked me, he said coolly. She always does. No one replied. Naomi turned slowly and left the room without a word. She didn't run. She didn't tremble. She moved like a woman shedding the last remnants of a skin that never belonged to her. Upstairs, she packed only what she needed. A few dresses, her grandmother's journal, A small photo of herself as a girl barefoot in her backyard garden, sunlight in her smile. She didn't know where she was going yet, only that she was leaving. She passed Eli on the landing. He stood at the base of the stairs, his eyes filled with a question he dared not ask aloud. She didn't stop, but as she brushed by him, she placed something in his palm, a pressed white rose perfectly preserved between the pages of her book. She whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." He opened his hand and stared at the delicate petals. And for the first time in a long, long while, Eli Grant closed his eyes and prayed not for her escape, but for her restoration. Naomi didn't go to a hotel. She didn't call her stepmother. She knew the betrayal of that woman's ambitions had paved the path to this gilded prison. She walked instead to a quiet corner of Santa Barbara, where the polished world of estates gave way to crumbling apartment blocks and the warmth of neighborhoods that smelled like home. There, tucked behind an aging Presbyterian church, was a women's shelter Naomi had donated to anonymously years ago. She arrived with no fanfare, no name recognition, only bruises hidden beneath her coat, and a voice she was still learning to reclaim. They welcomed her with open arms. That first night she didn't cry. She stared at the ceiling of her small cot, listening to the soft breathing of the woman beside her, the muffled whimpers of a child in another room. She wasn't alone in her pain. That truth became both a comfort and a quiet rebellion against everything Richard had made her believe. In the morning, she volunteered to help serve breakfast. She told no one who she was, and when asked her name, she simply said Naomi. It was enough. Weeks passed. Her body began to change in ways she hadn't expected. At first, it was the scent of coffee making her nauseous. Then the sudden fatigue, the dizziness, the heightened sense of taste. A test confirmed what her intuition already whispered: she was pregnant, with twins. Her hands trembled when she read the results. It wasn't the fear of motherhood she had dreamed of, holding her own child, of reading stories aloud and humming lullabies into warm necks. It was the knowledge of who their father was. And yet even then she did not falter. These children growing inside her were not born of violence. They were born of survival, of hope, of the fragile, stubborn light that had refused to be extinguished inside her. She pressed her palms to her belly. "You're mine," she whispered, "and I will never let the darkness touch you." One evening, as she was folding donated baby clothes at the shelter, she glanced at the television in the corner of the common room. Richard Langston was giving an interview. Polished, unapologetic. "We were never compatible," he was saying. "I gave her everything. But some women, they aren't built to support greatness." Naomi didn't speak. She stood slowly, walked to the screen, and turned off the volume. She looked down at her belly and smiled. She was done being silent. She was ready to build something new, something that didn't need marble floors or gold-trimmed mirrors. She was going to build a life. One word, one choice, one breath at a time. The rain came without warning, that night, sheets of silver falling from a velvet sky, soaking the narrow alleyways and splashing against the cracked pavement outside the shelter's worn entrance. Inside, the scent of chamomile tea and oatmeal lingered faintly in the air. The bunk beds creaked under quiet movement, and in the far corner of the women's dormitory, Naomi sat curled on the edge of her cot, both hands folded protectively over her growing belly. She had begun to feel them tiny flutters, whispers of life beneath her ribs. At first they startled her. Now they anchored her. The twins were the only certainty she had. Her world, once gilded and predictable in its cruelty, had transformed into one of shared space and whispered stories. Each woman around her had fled something: fists, silence, poverty, the echoes of decisions made too young and too alone. There was comfort in that sisterhood, no questions, no judgment, only the slow stitching of lives back together. Naomi volunteered at the shelter every day. She sorted donations, helped children with homework, wiped down counters, swept hallways, and organized shelves of donated food like they were sacred relics. The routine was grounding. It made her feel useful, present. But still, there were nights when the silence was loud enough to hear her memories. She missed music. She missed books that smelled like dust and time. She missed, though she tried not to admit it, the sound of Eli's voice. He had not come. She hadn't expected him to. He had risked enough already. But sometimes when she caught her reflection in the tiny mirror above the bathroom sink, she imagined what he would see, not a woman broken, but a woman rebuilding. Not someone to rescue, but someone worth waiting for. And then 2 weeks into her stay, something happened. A letter arrived. It was plain tucked among the stack of folded clothing left for her by one of the shelter volunteers. No return address, no name, just her first name written in that now familiar penmanship, slanted, spare, graceful. She opened it slowly, hands trembling, the scent of pressed flowers wafting from the paper. Inside was a single white rose, dried and intact, and beneath it a note. You once asked me why. Because I saw a storm inside you, and instead of drowning, you were learning to dance in the rain. Edward. She sat there for a long time, the letter cradled in her lap. A part of her wanted to weep. Another part only smiled, because she understood now he had not disappeared. He had stepped back quietly, respectfully, leaving a trail not of footsteps, but of reminders. She was not forgotten. That week, Naomi met with a caseworker. Do you have a long-term plan? The woman asked kindly, her eyes flicking toward Naomi's stomach. You'll need stable housing, employment, health care. Have you considered adoption? Naomi's spine straightened. They're mine. The caseworker nodded, perhaps expecting the answer, but needing to ask anyway. Do you have family? Naomi thought of her stepmother, the woman who had bartered her daughter's future for status and security. Then she thought of her grandmother, now long gone, who had taught her to spell her name by tracing it into bread dough, who told her that women carry generations in their bones. I do, Naomi said quietly. They're not here, but they're with me. The caseworker offered her a new address, an opening in a transitional housing program near a local community college. It wasn't much, just a room and shared kitchen, but it would be hers. Later that evening, Naomi packed her few belongings into a canvas bag. She folded the white rose in a handkerchief and pressed it between the pages of her grandmother's journal. Her fingers paused on a worn page where she'd once scribbled a dream. At 16, open a school. Teach children to read. Give them stories when the world gives them silence. She didn't cry. She stood, tied her hair in a scarf, and whispered, We're going home. The apartment was nothing like the estate she had left behind, and that was precisely why it felt like salvation. The walls were thin, the paint chipped, and the heater rattled like a nervous heart. But sunlight poured through the kitchen window in the mornings, and every squeaky floorboard seemed to sing with life. She decorated with what she had: photos clipped to string, secondhand books stacked into makeshift shelves, and a cradle she assembled herself with trembling hands and whispered lullabies. Her fingers traced the wood like she was blessing it. At night she talked to her daughters, naming them aloud even before their faces formed in her dreams. Arya, hope for the strength she didn't know she had, and Luna, grace for the gentleness that had never left her. She read to them every evening, sometimes poetry, sometimes her own letters unwritten and unfolding in real time. Other nights she wrote in silence. Her words poured into pages she never meant to publish, notes on motherhood, on freedom, on becoming, on healing. One morning just before dawn, Naomi woke to the first sharp kick beneath her ribs. She gasped aloud, hands flying to her stomach. Is that you, Luna? She whispered. Or is Arya just impatient like her mama? It was the smallest of moments, no witnesses, no grandeur. But Naomi's heart flooded with something purer than joy. This was the life she had chosen. No longer trapped behind gold gates or beneath marble ceilings. No longer speaking only when spoken to or smiling while her spirit withered. She had nothing now that the world would envy, except everything that mattered. Her daughters were coming, and they would never know cages. They would know music. They would know gardens. They would know stories. And they would know that once long ago their mother danced in the rain with nothing but a white rose pressed against her heart. Kenamanuum. It was late autumn when he found her again. The sun had begun to soften in the sky, its heat no longer biting, but golden gentle like fingers, trailing through hair like memories that had stopped aching and started to glow. Leaves rustled across the sidewalks of Santa Barbara, brittle and amber, and Naomi Carter stood in line at the community clinic pharmacy, both hands cradling the firm swell of her belly. Her back ached, her ankles throbbed, and the twins had spent the better part of the morning arguing for space inside her. Still, she smiled. There was something about waiting in a room full of mothers about trading, knowing looks with other women who had walked through shadow to find their way into the light. They didn't need to speak. Survival has its own language. She left the clinic with a small paper bag of prenatal vitamins, a brochure for parenting classes, and a sense of quiet purpose that grounded her. The street outside was filled with noise and life buses, wheezing street musicians playing guitars with weathered hands, children tugging on sleeves and laughing at pigeons. And then she saw him, across the street, standing still while the world moved around him. He hadn't changed much. His posture still carried a kind of elegant solitude, like a man always a few steps removed from the world, not out of arrogance, but out of grief. He wore a dark wool coat collar, turned slightly against the wind. His hair was longer now, brushed back at the temples, silver beginning to show. Their eyes met before either of them moved. Hers widened, unspoken questions blooming behind them. His softened as though a weight he'd been carrying alone for too long had finally been named. He crossed the street without hesitation. Naomi didn't move, couldn't. Eli, she said at last, her voice catching in the hollow of her throat. Elliot, he replied gently. My real name is Elliot Grant. She blinked, stunned. Not by the revelation itself, some part of her had always known there was more to him, but by the way he said it, not with pride, but with quiet honesty, as though shedding a layer he no longer wished to wear. You're Elliot Grant, she repeated slowly. The name was familiar, of course. The tech magnate who disappeared from public life after his company's meteoric rise. Rumors had swirled, tragedy, scandal, burnout, but no one really knew. Naomi had never connected him to the man who had once swept rose petals into her path like prayers. He nodded, then glanced at her stomach. May I? She nodded, her hands instinctively shifting to allow him close. He knelt gently and placed his palm near her side. For a moment they said nothing. Then one of the babies kicked. Naomi laughed, startled. Elliot looked up, his eyes brighter than she had ever seen them. They're strong, he said. They're mine, she replied. A pause. And they're safe now. He stood, a breath shuddering through him. I looked for you, he said softly. After you left. But I didn't want to interfere. I didn't want to appear like another man trying to decide your fate. Naomi studied him. So you waited. I watched from a distance. I sent the letter, the rose. But I knew this next part. It had to be yours alone. Her eyes filled not with tears, but with something steadier. Something like understanding. I didn't think I'd see you again, she said. I didn't think I deserved to, he replied. Silence wrapped around them for a moment, but it was warm, not awkward. The kind of silence that holds everything words can't reach. She glanced at the bench nearby. Would you sit with me? They walked together to the edge of the small park near the clinic. The bench was cold, but the sunlight dappled through the trees like it was blessing them. Naomi sat slowly, hands instinctively cradling her belly. Elliot sat beside her, leaving just enough space between them for dignity, but close enough for truth. I was 25 when I lost my wife, he said, eyes on the playground beyond them. Lena. We'd been married 3 years. She had cancer. The last 6 months. She made me promise to keep living. I thought I could. But all I did was disappear. Naomi listened. Not as a woman receiving a confession, but as one who knew grief when she heard it. And then I saw you, he continued. At the gala, you were smiling like your soul was somewhere else. I recognized it immediately. That kind of smile doesn't lie. She turned toward him. What did you see in me? He exhaled slowly. A woman trying to survive in a place that was quietly killing her. I didn't want to save you, Naomi. I wanted you to remember you were already worth saving. She closed her eyes, wine brushing across her cheeks like a caress. No one had ever done that before, she whispered. They sat in silence, the kind that felt like healing. Cars passed. Children shrieked joyfully from the monkey bars. Life moved around them, but for Naomi and Elliot, time paused. Eventually she asked, why now? Because I'm ready, he said simply. Not to fix you, not to claim you, but to walk beside you if you'll let me. And if you won't, that's all right too. I'll still be here. Not as a man who owes you anything, but as someone who finally found something worth coming back for. Naomi didn't answer. Not with words. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand on his. Her fingers were small, strong, steady. And for the first time in years, Elliot Grant felt something rise in his chest that he had not dared name hope. They didn't speak again for a while. The baby stirred inside her as if sensing that the world outside their mother's body was slowly making room for light. Naomi leaned her head against Elliot's shoulder. And there in the middle of a small city park on a bench older than their scars, a woman who had survived and a man who had finally returned sat quietly between the ruins of what had been and the fragile, luminous beginning of what might still be. Sucker Kitty. The apartment hadn't changed. The chipped paint still curled in the corners like tired petals. The heater still wheezed to life with the stubborn groan of old machines. But when Naomi opened the door with Elliot standing quietly behind her, it felt like something sacred was stepping across the threshold. She hadn't planned to invite him up. She hadn't even planned to see him again. But after hours in the park sharing pieces of their buried pasts, their losses and small victories, the idea of parting without knowing what tomorrow held felt suddenly unbearable. "This is it," she said, simply gesturing to the room as she slipped off her shoes. The afternoon sun slipped in through the thin curtains, casting golden stripes across the floor. A small bookshelf stood proudly near the window, its contents a mix of poetry, parenting books, and secondhand novels. A bassinet waited beside her bed draped in hand-stitched linens, and in one corner stood a tiny armchair with a soft blue blanket draped over it. "I love it," Elliot said, his voice low, reverent. "It's not much. It's yours." Naomi paused, her breath catching faintly. She hadn't realized until that moment how rarely she heard those words, yours. Everything in the Langston estate had been borrowed, assigned, controlled. But this space, this modest apartment with its mismatched dishes and humming pipes was her creation. Her choice, her triumph. She turned toward the kitchen. "I don't have much to offer, but there's tea. Tea would be perfect." She moved slowly, the fullness of her belly guiding her rhythm. Elliot followed, keeping his distance, his presence, a quiet tether she hadn't known she needed. As the kettle began to hiss, he stood near the window, hands in his pockets, watching the way the light flickered against the baby mobile she had hung from the ceiling. He noticed everything. "You built all this yourself?" he asked. She nodded, placing two mismatched mugs on the counter. "With help, donations, quiet kindness from people who've walked their own roads." Elliot smiled gently, lifting the mobile with one finger. Tiny paper birds spun in the air, suspended by fishing line and hope. Naomi poured the tea and slid one cup toward him. Their fingers brushed. Electricity passed between them, not the kind that burns, but the kind that reminds you you're alive. They moved to the armchair, Naomi settling with practiced grace, her spine straightening against the backrest. Elliot sat on the floor beside her, legs crossed as though proximity needed no fanfare. "What are you thinking?" he asked after a long silence. Naomi sipped her tea, then looked down at him. "That I never thought I'd have this. Not just the peace, but the freedom to choose who sits beside me." He said nothing, just looked up at her, his eyes reflecting something soft and raw. "I used to believe love came with a cost." She continued, her voice a fragile thread. "That it demanded silence, sacrifice, survival. But this us now, it feels like exhale. Like a room with the windows open." Elliot tilted his head. "That's what it should feel like." She smiled, brushing a loose curl from her cheek. "And you? What does this feel like to you?" He looked down at his hands for a moment before answering. "Like I've finally come home from a war I didn't know I was still fighting." Neither of them moved. The clock on the wall ticked softly, and then Naomi reached out. Her hand found the nape of his neck, her fingers curling gently in his hair. He closed his eyes, not because he was overwhelmed, but because he trusted her touch more than words. She didn't kiss him. Not yet. Instead, she pressed her forehead against his and whispered, "Stay a little longer." That evening, they moved through the quiet rhythm of ordinary things. She showed him her sketches for a community literacy program she hoped to propose. He offered to help build a website. They folded baby clothes together, their hands brushing over soft fabric, pausing on tiny socks that made them both laugh. And when she grew tired, he helped her to bed carefully, tenderly, his hands never lingering too long, always asking permission with his eyes. Naomi lay down, one hand resting protectively over her belly. "You can sit beside me," she murmured, eyes half closed. "If you don't mind lullabies sung off key." He did. And as her voice drifted into the dim room, low, husky, full of memory, Elliot sat quietly listening, as though every note was a thread sewing him back together. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. Love, he understood now, could live in presence, in patience, in choosing to stay through the silences. Long after her breathing deepened, Elliot remained there watching over her, like something sacred had been entrusted into his care. Through the cracked window, a breeze rustled the curtain. And somewhere deep within, Naomi dreamed not of marble halls or designer gowns, but of a garden blooming in sunlight, two daughters running barefoot in the grass, and a man standing beside her with soil on his hands and laughter in his eyes. A future not promised, but one she was finally brave enough to imagine. The world looked different in the early hours, softer, quieter, as though even time had slowed to listen. Outside Naomi's window, the city stirred gently to life, the muffled hum of buses, the far-off bark of a dog, the rhythmic clatter of someone unlocking their bakery 2 blocks over. But within her small apartment, it was still twilight, that sacred sliver of time when yesterday had ended, but today had not fully arrived. Naomi awoke to the weight of warmth behind her, not heavy but steady. She didn't startle. She remembered. She remembered the way Elliot had stayed, the way he had kept vigil beside her, humming under his breath as she drifted into sleep, the way his silence never demanded, only offered. And she remembered the deep, unspoken calm that had come with it, like falling asleep inside the safety of someone's prayer. She turned gently, her belly now so large that even the smallest movement required grace. Elliot sat on the floor, still, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, his head tilted back, fast asleep. Naomi studied him in the half-light, her gaze tracing the contours of his face. He looked younger in sleep, though sorrow still clung to the lines around his eyes like old shadows, reluctant to leave. Quietly she rose. She moved toward the window, the wooden floor creaking under her bare feet. Her hands cradled her belly, her fingers instinctively stroking across the swell, where her daughters now danced almost hourly, tiny tides moving beneath her skin. The first rays of sunlight kissed the rooftops across the street. She stood there for a moment, bathed in gold. She didn't need to look in a mirror to know how much she had changed. The Naomi who once trembled in pearls and designer silk, the woman who smiled through clenched teeth at charity galas, no longer lived here. In her place was someone slower, deeper, worn in all the right ways. There was something beautiful in that, in not needing to be polished to be seen. A soft rustle behind her. She turned. Elliot was awake, rubbing his eyes with the heel of one hand, blinking sleep from lashes that still carried the weight of too many sleepless years. "Morning," she said softly. He sat up straighter. "Did I fall asleep on your floor?" "You did," she said with a smile, and snored once impressively. He chuckled, the sound low and warm. "I told myself I'd stay awake to make sure you were okay." "I was." She returned to the armchair as he rose and stretched his joints, popping in the stillness. He moved with quiet confidence, a man no longer running from himself. "I should go," he murmured, though he made no effort to move toward the door. "You could stay for breakfast," Naomi offered. "If you like toast and overcooked eggs." "I'd stay for burnt toast." She laughed, a full laugh, the kind that curled up from the chest and loosened something in the ribs. She hadn't known how much she needed to hear herself laugh like that until just then. She moved into the kitchen while he filled the kettle, their movements folding into one another like steps in a practiced dance. No instructions, no glances, just presence. As the scent of butter and bread filled the air, Naomi glanced at Elliot. "Why did you leave it all behind?" she asked. "Your company, your wealth, the life everyone else was chasing?" He was quiet a moment, flipping the toast with deliberate ease. "Because I lost someone and realized I had spent years building a life that meant nothing without love in it." He turned to her gently, placing the toast on a plate. "I thought I was strong, that I could keep going just by working harder, creating more. But grief, it rewrites everything. I disappeared because I didn't know how to live with absence. And then I met you." Her heart caught. You reminded me he continued what it means to stay, to choose life even when it's imperfect, especially then. She didn't respond with words. Instead, she placed a hand over his, letting her fingers speak the softness she couldn't yet name aloud. They ate in companionable silence, occasionally trading stories about childhood. His summers in Maine, her grandmother's collard greens, the way they both secretly hated school picture day. Laughter folded into the room like sunlight through the curtains. After breakfast, she sat by the window once more, her hands pressing into her lower back. Getting heavier, he asked. Like carrying a cathedral, she said dryly. A beautiful one. He moved behind her and knelt, his hands hovering with hesitation. May I? She nodded. He pressed his hands gently into the small of her back, slow, warm, patient. The tension began to ease, her breath slowing. She closed her eyes, letting herself fall into the rhythm of care, of being cared for. No transaction, no expectation, just presence. A knock at the door startled them both. Naomi opened her eyes and rose, her heart suddenly tight. Visitors were rare and unannounced ones rarer still. She moved slowly toward the door and opened it an inch. Outside stood an older woman, one Naomi hadn't seen in over a year. Her stepmother, draped in a tailored coat, holding a small leather clutch, her expression a strange mix of guilt and practiced concern. Naomi, she said, her voice strained. We need to talk. The past surged forward like a wave Naomi had forgotten was still chasing her. Behind her, Elliot stood quietly, not approaching, not interrupting. Just there, Naomi straightened her spine. She looked into the face of the woman who once traded her future for a mansion and whispered, You're late. The woman blinked. Excuse me, I don't need what you came to offer. Not your pity, not your excuses. There was no anger in her voice, only clarity. Her stepmother opened her mouth, but Naomi had already begun to close the door. From behind it, she heard Elliot speak, his voice steady, protective. She doesn't owe you anything. And with that, the door shut softly. Naomi turned to him, breath unsteady but not broken. Thank you, she whispered. He looked at her with something quiet and infinite in his eyes. I'm here, he said. She nodded. And for the first time, she believed him. The past may still knock, may still rattle the lock, but it would never live here again. This home had already chosen light. The evening air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the sound of a lullaby humming low from Naomi's lips. Inside the apartment, soft lamplight spilled over the room like a blessing, brushing warmth onto every surface it touched. The bookshelf, lined with borrowed novels, the handmade mobile above the cradle, the stack of folded onesies that waited with quiet anticipation. Naomi stood barefoot in the center of the room, one hand pressed gently against her lower belly. The twins had been restless that day, turning and kicking as though they too were aware that the seasons were changing. It's almost time, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Elliot looked up from where he sat on the floor near the cradle, slowly assembling a second bassinet with focused patience. The instructions were long gone, but he worked from instinct now, gently, thoughtfully, pausing to wipe his hands on a towel before checking each screw. He smiled. Are they practicing gymnastics again? They're competing for dominance, she replied, laughing softly. I think Arya is winning. Of course she is. Naomi looked at him, head tilted. You say that like you know her already. Elliot paused. I think I do, a little. Naomi eased herself onto the edge of the couch, breathing through the familiar tightness in her back. And Luna. He set the tiny wrench down and turned toward her, his voice gentling. She's the quiet one, but her silence has weight. I think she's watching everything. I think she's the one who'll speak with her eyes first and her words later. Naomi smiled. You're describing them like they're already here. He nodded, something soft behind his gaze. They are, in every choice you've made, in every breath you take. She fell silent, then her fingers trailing over the blanket spread across her lap. It was the same one she'd brought with her from the shelter, faded, a little frayed, but stitched with a memory she hadn't yet shared. My grandmother made this, she said quietly, the week I was born. She told me that every generation in our family had something passed down, sometimes a recipe, sometimes a story, sometimes nothing but a name. Elliot watched her closely. What will you pass down? Naomi was quiet for a long moment. Then in a voice low and trembling, she said, freedom. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Naomi looked up at him, her eyes glistening. Do you ever think names can carry the weight of our prayers? All the time, he said. Sometimes names are the only thing we give our children that lasts beyond us. She reached for a small leather-bound notebook on the coffee table. Inside were dozens of scribbled ideas, crossed-out combinations, names in different languages and alphabets. But at the very front of the book were two names circled in delicate ink. Arya Hope, Luna Grace. She'll ask one day why I named her Hope, Naomi said. And I'll tell her it was the only thing I clung to when I had nothing else. That it was the light I fed on in the dark. And Grace, Elliot asked softly. Naomi turned to him. Because grace is the gift I never knew I deserved until I met you. The air shifted between them, taut with emotion. For a long time, they sat in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't demand, doesn't accuse, it just holds you. Elliot moved closer, not touching her, yet only folding himself into the space beside her like he belonged there. Like he always had. I was thinking, he said finally, that if you'd ever want them to carry my name too, I would be honored. Naomi looked at him. Her heart beat loud in her chest, not out of fear, but out of recognition. There was no obligation in his offer, no possession in his voice, only reverence. They already carry it, she said. His brows furrowed, confused. They carry your love, she continued, your care, your steadiness. It doesn't matter what the certificate says. They'll know who you are. They'll know who stayed. His eyes filled, and he lowered his head, brushing his fingers over his lips as though to contain all the emotion rushing through him. When he looked back up, she leaned forward carefully, slowly, and pressed her forehead to his. You're already their father, she whispered. His breath shuddered against hers. And in that moment, something ancient and quiet passed between them. Not a declaration, not even a promise, but a belonging. Later that night, Naomi lay curled on her side in bed, her fingers laced gently with Elliot's. He hadn't left. He hadn't even asked to stay. He simply moved with her through the night like wind through curtains, like prayer through silence. Her eyes closed and he watched her sleep. Outside, the rain began again, soft like a blessing, tapping against the glass in a rhythm older than time. And Elliot, who had once disappeared from the world to protect his grief, now sat still beside a woman who had taught him that healing could arrive not in lightning bolts or grand gestures, but in small rooms and whispered names, in the quiet decision to stay. He glanced once more at the leather-bound notebook, then at her, and then ever so quietly he said to the air between them, I'll love them the way I never got to love before. I'll carry them with the strength I found in you. And with that, he closed his eyes. The first light of morning waited just beyond the clouds, and for once they would greet it together. The morning began not with a cry, but with stillness. A breath held, a body stilled in that impossible moment between what was and what is about to be. Naomi lay in bed, her palm braced against her belly, her fingers trembling. The light from the window stretched across the room in long golden strokes, painting the floor, the foot of the bed, and the edge of the bassinet that waited with such quiet expectation. Then again, a pressure like no other, deep, full, ancient, as if the earth itself had opened inside her and something sacred was rising to the surface. She didn't call out. She didn't panic. She simply whispered, it's time. From the small sofa in the corner, Elliot stirred, already half awake. He'd slept there every night since her stepmother's visit, never assuming space in her bed, but always close enough to rise if she needed him. He sat up instantly when he heard her voice. Naomi. She turned her face to him. Her smile was small and strained, but it held a strength that could command oceans. The girls are coming. He was on his feet in a second, all the practiced calm of a man who had rehearsed this in his mind 100 times. Okay, we have the bag ready. I'll call the cab. Naomi tried to sit up, bracing herself on the edge of the mattress. A contraction rolled through her, slow and burning, and she breathed through it, eyes closed, her fingers curled into the blanket. Elliot dropped to his knees before her. Breathe with me, he whispered, taking her hands. She nodded. Their breaths synced slow and deep, like waves smoothing the edge of a storm. By the time the cab arrived, Naomi was leaning heavily into Elliot's side, her steps short, her jaw clenched. But she didn't cry out. Not once. Her strength was not in silence, but in the choice to keep moving forward one breath at a time. The driver asked no questions. Perhaps he'd seen this kind of love before, the urgent, protective kind that doesn't demand attention, but draws it anyway. Elliot held Naomi the entire ride, his hand braced behind her back, whispering encouragement into the curve of her neck. When they arrived at the hospital, nurses moved quickly, efficiently ushering Naomi into a birthing suite. The lights were soft, the walls were warm, and Elliot never let go of her hand. The hours passed slowly, then all at once. Naomi labored with a grace Elliot would later struggle to put into words. She was thunder and prayer, pain and beauty, the storm before the harvest. There were moments when she cried out raw, guttural sounds that broke the stillness, but never once did she retreat into fear. Every time her eyes met Elliot's, she anchored herself again. "You're doing it," he whispered. "You're everything." The doctor entered near the final hour, offering instructions that blurred in the air between them. Nurses moved like shadows, gentle and precise. And then, after one final push that tore through the silence and into the light, a cry. High, clear, demanding. Naomi sobbed, her face wet with effort and awe. "It's Arya," she whispered. A few moments later, another cry joined the first, quieter but sure. "And Luna," Elliot said, voice breaking. "She's here too." The twins were placed against Naomi's chest, their small bodies damp and perfect, their cries already sinking, like their souls had been dancing together long before this world ever knew them. Naomi held them as if the entire world could fit between her arms. She whispered their names like a poem, her forehead pressed to their downy heads. Elliot stood beside her, silent tears carving through the stubble of his cheeks. His hands hovered for a moment, uncertain, reverent, until Naomi looked up at him and said simply, "You're their father." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a negotiation. It was the naming of a truth that had already been lived. He placed his hand gently over Arya's back, then Luna's. They were so small, so impossibly new. But as they settled into the rhythm of their mother's heartbeat, he felt something shift inside him. Something old and aching finally laid to rest. Love had arrived, and it wore two names. Later, the room grew quiet again. The nurses stepped out. The doctor left them with congratulations and a smile. Naomi rested with her eyes closed, the girl swaddled against her. Elliot sat beside her, unwilling to look away even for a moment. His world had been reduced to this room, to the scent of newborn skin and lavender, to the sound of breath and heartbeat and something sacred in between. "Thank you," he said softly. Naomi didn't open her eyes. "For what?" "For letting me come back." She shifted slightly, her voice drowsy but sure. "You never really left." He watched her for a long while, brushing a curl from her temple, memorizing the curve of her nose, the line of her jaw, the gentle strength that radiated from every part of her. The twins stirred in their sleep. Arya's hand reached out blindly, landing on Luna's cheek. The contact stilled them both. "See," Naomi murmured, barely audible. "They already know how to hold each other." Elliot pressed his lips to her forehead. The rain had ended outside. The sun had returned warm and golden against the window pane. And in a quiet hospital room filled with the first breaths of new life, a man who once lost everything and a woman who once had no one now sat together as a family, each holding more than they ever thought they were allowed to dream. The rhythm of arrival had passed. What remained now was life, unfolding, beginning, becoming. The days that followed unfolded like pages of a handwritten letter, creased at the edges, ink smudged in places, but every word tender and true. Back home, Naomi moved slowly through her apartment, the soft shuffle of her slippers marking a rhythm that no longer belonged to urgency, but to presence. The twins slept in alternating shifts, their cries now familiar notes in a lullaby that had reshaped her entire world. Moonlight spilled across the living room each night, and with it came peace, not the silence of emptiness, but the hush of something finally whole. Elliot had stayed, not just in name, not just in gesture, but fully. Every morning he brewed tea before Naomi stirred, holding Luna close to his chest as he swayed in the kitchen, like a man who'd spent his whole life waiting to be that still. Every evening he sang low to Arya, brushing her forehead with his lips as though each breath was a vow. They didn't talk about the future yet. It wasn't avoidance, it was reverence. They were learning the art of now. On the fifth night home, as the twins finally slept side by side in their bassinets, Naomi sat near the window with a journal in her lap and Elliot at her feet reading quietly. "You always do that," she said softly, her pen hovering above the page. "Do what?" "Read the same paragraph 5 times when you're thinking." He looked up and laughed, a sound that had grown more frequent, more natural. "Caught." Naomi smiled, then returned to her writing. She'd been keeping a journal since her second trimester. A place not for facts, but for memories that didn't want to be forgotten. The first time the girls kicked at the same time the cravings that came like waves, the scent of rain during her third appointment. And now as the city exhaled beyond their window, she began writing letters. Not to herself, not to Elliot, but to Arya and Luna. "My sweet girls," she wrote. "You arrived like thunder softened by a hymn. You came with fists clenched and lungs ready like warriors returning to a home they'd never seen but always known. And somehow in the middle of it all, you gave me breath I didn't know I'd lost." She paused, her fingers resting on the paper before continuing. "You are not just my daughters. You are the light that chose me. And this home, this soft, imperfect space is yours. There are things I want to tell you, not just once, but every day in all the ways I can." Elliot, having set down his book, watched her with quiet reverence. He didn't interrupt. He simply reached for her free hand and held it as she wrote. "You will grow in a world that may not always be gentle, but you come from women who endured, who stitched strength into silence, and you come from a man who loved not to possess, but to protect. Remember, this gentleness is not weakness. Love is not a transaction, and each of you are already enough exactly as you are." Naomi's eyes glistened. She closed the journal, pressing her palm to its leather cover like sealing a promise. She turned toward Elliot. "Do you want to write them something?" He hesitated, then nodded. She passed the journal to him. He sat for a moment, pen in hand, staring at the blank page as if it were a cathedral. Then he began to write. "To my daughters," he wrote the word "my" blooming slowly beneath his hand. "I never thought I would have the right to speak that word again. After Lena, after all the silence. But you've given me a new beginning, and with it, a second heart. I want you to know, if nothing else, that you were never an accident. You were a miracle that chose us. I may not be perfect, I won't always have the right words, but I will be here. For every scraped knee, every science project, every midnight phone call, I will show up, and that is how you will know I love you." He paused, then added one last line. "Because love is not what we say, it's what we stay for." When he finished, he looked up at Naomi. She didn't speak, only took the journal back and held it close to her chest like it carried not just their words, but their future. They sat together in silence, the soft breathing of their daughters the only sound between them. The moon rose higher, casting its silver signature across the window pane. Naomi leaned her head on Elliot's shoulder. He turned slightly, resting his cheek against her hair. And then in that soft, suspended moment, she whispered something she hadn't dared to say aloud before. "I never thought I'd get to be happy again." Elliot's arm circled around her. "You didn't just find happiness, Naomi," he said. "You built it. From nothing but your own strength." She turned to him, eyes shining. "With you." He nodded, brushing his lips across her forehead. "With us." Outside, the street lights flickered, casting halos on the sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour. And inside that modest apartment, filled with the scent of sleep and ink and newborn skin, two people who once thought their best chapters had been lost sat together writing a new story. One sentence at a time, one breath after the other. It began with a letter, folded carefully, its edges neat, the paper still smelling faintly of lavender and memory. Naomi found it tucked beneath the door one misty afternoon as the girls slept, and Elliot returned from the market with arms full of groceries and the quiet contentment of a man who now lived in the rhythm of small joys. She didn't recognize the handwriting at first, but as her eyes traced the curves of each letter, a breath caught in her throat. It was from her stepmother. She sat on the edge of the couch, the letter trembling in her hand. For a long time she said nothing. Elliot watched her, his brow furrowed, a bag of lemons still dangling from his wrist. "What is it?" he asked gently. She handed him the letter without a word, and as he read, silence settled in the room like a dusting of snow, gentle, quiet, uninvited. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was an opening, a recognition. I didn't know how to mother you, the letter said, but I've come to learn that failing to nurture is not the same as not loving. I failed you, not because you weren't worthy of love, but because I didn't know how to offer what I never received. Naomi stared at the carpet. She always used to say that being hard was how you survived. That softness got you eaten. Elliot knelt beside her, setting the lemons down. She was wrong. She was hurt, Naomi said quietly. And I didn't save myself by proving her wrong. I saved myself by choosing not to become her. The weight of that truth pressed into the room like a long-awaited storm, and then just as gently it passed. Naomi folded the letter and set it aside. I'll write her back one day. Not yet. Elliot nodded, then took her hand, kissed the inside of her palm. Not everything needs to be forgiven today. That night, a thunderstorm swept in from the coast, dark clouds rolling above the rooftops like an ancient roiling sea. Naomi stood by the window with Arya cradled in one arm, Luna sleeping peacefully in the cradle. Elliot joined her, holding her waist from behind as lightning flickered distantly across the horizon. They're not afraid, Naomi said, glancing at the sleeping girls. They haven't learned to be, he replied. She turned slightly to look up at him. Do you think we're afraid? Elliot considered that, brushing a thumb against her hip. No, he said. I think we're careful, but I think fear left when you let me stay. The storm beat against the glass, but inside the apartment, the air was calm, warmed by bodies that had learned to rest in the presence of trust. Later that week, Elliot received a phone call from his former business partner. They hadn't spoken in nearly 2 years. We're rebuilding, the man said. Not just the company, but the way we run it. I thought you might want to return. As a consultant, even part-time. Your name still means something, Elliot. Elliot stood in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, his eyes flicking to where Naomi nursed Arya, in the soft chair by the window. The sunlight framed her like a portrait, golden and patient, her face glowing with the ease of purpose. Thank you, Elliot said quietly. But I've already returned. Just not to the place you meant. The man didn't understand. But Elliot didn't need him to. He hung up and slipped back into the room. Naomi looked up. Everything okay? He smiled. I'm where I need to be. She reached for his hand. You don't miss it. Not the boardrooms. Not the polished lies dressed as vision. What I miss, I found again in quieter forms. Building something that matters. Being needed without being consumed. Naomi laughed gently. You sound like a man who's planting tomatoes and reading bedtime stories. He raised an eyebrow. You say that like it's a lesser calling. She squeezed his hand. It's the holiest one I know. Spring came early that year. The tree outside their window bloomed overnight, tiny buds bursting into soft pink blossoms, like secrets too long held finally spoken aloud. Naomi carried the twins to the park one afternoon, wrapped in slings across her chest, their small hands clutching the fabric of her sweater. Elliot walked beside her, a second-hand camera slung across his shoulder. He'd begun taking portraits again, not for exhibitions, not for clients, but for truth. They passed an older couple on the bench near the fountain. The woman smiled at Naomi. Beautiful girls, she said. Twins. Naomi nodded. Arya and Luna. The woman leaned closer, her voice soft. You look like you've been through a storm. Naomi didn't flinch. I have. The woman's smile widened. But you came out of it blooming. And Naomi, with her daughter sleeping against her heart, and the hand of the man she loved in hers, whispered, Yes, I did. That evening they walked home slowly, the fading sun casting long shadows behind them. Elliot snapped a photo. Naomi turning her head to smile, the girls curled peacefully against her, the city quiet and wide behind them. He would frame that photo, not for a gallery, but for the wall above their dining table, a reminder that stories don't end at heartbreak. Sometimes they begin there. Sometimes they're not written in ink, but in quiet mornings, shared blankets, small hands clutching your finger in the dark. And sometimes the rain doesn't drown you. Sometimes it teaches you how to grow. The apartment smelled of cinnamon warm milk and something else, something that wasn't in any cookbook, but that lingered just as long. It was the scent of belonging, of mornings that didn't begin in fear, and nights that ended in laughter too tired to rise past a whisper. Elliot was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, flour dusting the corners of his shirt like snow from a happier world. He was attempting banana muffins for the third time. The last two batches had been edible barely, but Naomi had kissed him on the cheek both times and said, "They taste like love," which only made him more determined to earn her praise for the flavor, not just the effort. Naomi sat nearby at the table, Luna asleep in a sling across her chest, while Arya, awake and curious, clutched a wooden spoon with both fists and tried to beat the table into submission. Naomi watched her daughter's determined little face and chuckled gently, guiding her grip. "She's going to be a handful," she murmured. "Or a revolution," Elliot said, glancing over with a grin. The kitchen had become the heart of their life. Once just a space for necessity, now it pulsed with intention. Meals prepared with slow hands, herbs grown on the windowsill mugs that always sat just a little off-center on the counter. Here, Naomi and Elliot had learned to breathe in sync, not as a miracle, but as a practice. Today was a quiet Sunday. No visitors, no appointments. Just the hum of the oven and the soft cooing of children in the background of their ordinary. And in that simplicity, Naomi felt something she hadn't recognized for years: steadiness. Not the kind born of predictability, but the kind you build with your own hands through forgiveness, through patience, through an endless string of tiny, generous acts. As the muffins rose in the oven, Naomi took out the small hand-sewing kit she hadn't touched in months. A tiny seam on Arya's favorite blanket had come undone. It was nothing urgent, but something in her longed to mend it herself. She threaded the needle slowly, her movements mindful. Elliot came to her with a glass of water and a kiss for her temple. "You okay?" She nodded. "I like doing this." "I know," he said. "It's how you pour yourself into things." She smiled at that. "You ever think about how we were both broken when we met, and now we're here baking and sewing and raising little girls who don't know anything about the things we lost?" Elliot sat beside her, taking Arya gently into his arms. The baby gave a sleepy protest before settling against his chest. "I don't think we're unbroken," he said thoughtfully. "But maybe we're reshaped, like something beautiful that's been through fire." Naomi looked down at the nearly invisible stitches she'd made. "Like kintsugi. The Japanese art of repairing pottery with gold," he said, recognizing the reference. "You don't hide the cracks, you honor them." She nodded. "Exactly." They sat in silence, the kind that asked nothing of them but presence. Naomi watched Elliot with Arya, how his big hands cradled her so gently, how his breath matched hers as though he'd practiced it in dreams. She thought about the journey here, the shelter, the letter, the first ultrasound in a room with flickering lights, the hospital room with rain beating down outside, and now this home shaped not by money or marble, but by devotion. Later that day, they took the girls to the community garden. Naomi wore Luna in a wrap, while Elliot carried Arya in his arms, her tiny sun hat crooked and absurdly charming. Naomi knelt beside a raised bed and showed Luna how to press a seed into soil. "We make things with our hands," she whispered. "Things that grow." Nearby, Elliot whispered to Arya, pointing to a tomato blossom. "This is where it all starts. It doesn't look like much yet. But wait." Their neighbors passed by an elderly woman who always gave the girls crochet booties, a young couple from upstairs who had started learning sign language just to talk to the twins as they grew. They weren't alone anymore. That evening, Naomi and Elliot sat on the fire escape with mugs of chamomile and a bowl of their still slightly too dense banana muffins. "You know," Naomi said, tearing a piece and handing it to him, "these are better. I used more cinnamon and less judgment," she teased. He laughed, leaning his shoulder into hers. As dusk painted the sky in lavender and rose, Naomi reached for his hand. "I used to think love had to be grand to be real. Expensive dinners, passionate declarations, jewelry that sparkled enough to blind you." And now, Elliot asked softly, "Now I think love is what you make with your hands, a repaired blanket, a half-burned muffin, a cradle you build even before you know if the baby will come." He turned her hand over, pressing a kiss into her palm. "Then I hope our daughters grow up with hands full of love." "They will," Naomi said without hesitation, "because they'll learn from us." Inside, Luna stirred and Arya let out a soft cry. Without a word, both Naomi and Elliot stood and went inside, slipping into the rhythm they now knew by heart. Naomi lifted Luna, murmuring a melody her grandmother used to hum, while Elliot cradled Arya, their heads bent low, their bodies curled close. And somewhere between the soft sigh of a rocking chair and the hum of love passed down in lullabies, two parents, once strangers to peace, found themselves held in the miracle of what they had made together, with nothing but their hands, their hearts, and the choice to stay. The sun fell gently across the wooden floorboards, tracing long golden fingers toward the crib where Arya slept, her tiny fist curled beside her cheek. Luna, already awake, stared up at the slow-turning mobile above her, silent and thoughtful, as though the colors and shadows were trying to speak in a language only she understood. Naomi stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, her silhouette calm, her gaze full. She wasn't just watching her daughter, she was watching time. Not the kind you measure in minutes, but in moments that root deep in your memory and stay there unfaded. Behind her, Elliot emerged from the kitchen, drying his hands on a towel barefoot and rumpled in the most domestic way. He stepped up behind her and rested his chin on her shoulder, exhaling. "She's going to be an artist," he murmured, nodding toward Luna. "And Arya, a fire starter," he said with a smile. Naomi leaned into him, feeling the steady thrum of his presence. Their bodies had grown fluent in the language of togetherness, leaning, sharing space, exhaling into one another without asking. "We should take them to the sea," she said suddenly, the idea fluttering out of her like a wish. Elliot blinked. "The sea?" "Before they remember it," she said, turning toward him, "so that it can live in them anyway. So that one day when life gets loud, they'll still have a memory, maybe not even conscious of waves and wind and light dancing on water." He looked at her, his expression softening into something almost reverent. "Then we'll go." 2 weeks later, they stood at the edge of a quiet coastline in Maine, where the air was cool and salted, and the tide rolled in like a lullaby sung by the earth itself. Naomi wore a wide-brimmed straw hat, Luna asleep against her chest, while Elliot held Arya close in his arms, the baby's eyes wide with wonder at the great glittering expanse. They didn't speak much. There was something sacred in the moment, two souls who had walked through fire now standing barefoot on a shoreline, letting the sea wind kiss their skin and the horizon offer them something they'd forgotten how to name. Healing. Not the kind that declares itself loudly, but the kind that hums softly under your ribs, telling you, "You made it. You're here. You're safe." Naomi sat on a blanket, letting the sand warm her legs while Luna stirred. Elliot set Arya down beside her and joined them, pressing a kiss to Naomi's temple. "I didn't think I'd ever have this again," he said quietly. "Not after Lena." Naomi didn't flinch at the name. She'd asked about her once, just once. And when he'd spoken about his daughter, his voice had trembled, but it hadn't broken. Now, as the sea whispered behind them, Naomi took his hand. "You don't have her again," she said, "but you get to love again. And that's not betrayal, that's resurrection." Elliot's breath caught, and for a moment he looked away, blinking at the light on the waves. "When I lost her," he whispered, "I thought love had an expiration date. I thought it ended, that after enough pain, the heart stopped letting light in." Naomi turned his face back to hers, their foreheads brushing. "But it didn't. You let it in again." He nodded. "Because you didn't give up on me." "No," she said, "because you didn't give up on yourself." The tide came in closer now, washing near their feet, erasing footprints only to welcome new ones. Arya let out a squeal of delight, her tiny hands reaching for the foam. Naomi laughed. "She's fearless. She gets that from her mother." "No," she whispered. "She gets that from knowing she's loved." And that was the truth. They had built everything, and not the absence of fear or pain or sorrow, but the presence of love that stayed, that bent and bruised and healed, that made space again and again, even when the world tried to close it off. That evening, back at the cottage, Elliot lit a small fire in the hearth, while Naomi rocked both girls to sleep. The crackle of flame and the slow rhythm of her song filled the room with a peace Elliot never believed he'd know again. When the girls were finally asleep, Naomi set them gently into the travel cribs, then crossed the room to him, curling into his side on the rug. He draped a blanket around them, and they watched the fire together, their fingers intertwined. "I used to dream of a different life," Naomi said softly. "One where I never got left behind. One where I had the perfect parents, the perfect education, the safety net everyone else seemed to get." Elliot looked down at her. "And now I dream of this," she said. Not because it's perfect, but because it's ours. Because we made it from the ashes. He didn't reply, not with words, just pulled her closer, held her tighter. Outside, the wind whispered across the dunes. Inside, the fire glowed like the quiet heart of something eternal. And in that room where love had been lost and found again, where grief had danced with healing and decided to stay for tea, two people sat holding each other, and everything they'd built not by accident, but by choosing every day to love, not just who the other was, but who they were becoming. That was the shape of their forever. Not a wedding ring, not a declaration shouted from rooftops, but this fire, this peace, these babies sleeping in the corner, these hands held without urgency. This life, exactly as it was, and finally as it was meant to be. It was a Tuesday when Naomi woke first. The city outside their window still held its breath in that fragile space between night and dawn, when even the birds hesitated before singing and the streets hadn't yet remembered their rhythm. She slipped from bed in silence, her feet brushing the cool floorboards, her robe wrapped loosely around her. The twins were still asleep, Luna curled like a comma in her crib, Arya sprawled in her own little rebellion of space. Elliot murmured something in his dreams and turned over his arm, searching instinctively for her absence. In the kitchen, Naomi lit a candle instead of flicking on the light. It was something her grandmother used to do, an act of reverence, she'd said, for the day ahead. She brewed tea. The scent of mint and honey rose softly through the room, and as she stood by the window, hands cradling the warm cup, she realized this unremarkable moment was her vow. Not a vow sealed in ceremony or gold, but in presence, in choosing this morning and the next, and the one after that. Elliot appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, his hair tousled, his t-shirt wrinkled. He paused when he saw her, then smiled in that slow way of his that always felt like a sunrise meant just for her. "You're up early," he said, voice still wrapped in sleep. Naomi gestured toward the kettle. "I made you tea." He crossed the room and kissed her forehead. "You always take care of everyone first." She shrugged. "It's how I show love." He took the cup and held it between both hands. "Then I'm the richest man alive." They stood there sipping in silence, the candle flickering between them. Outside, the city stretched its limbs, the sun beginning to touch the tops of buildings. After the girls woke, they bundled everyone up and walked to the park. The air was crisp and the leaves had begun to shift, burnt ochre, golden rust, a tapestry of endings and beginnings. They laid out a small blanket beneath the tree where they had first taken photos months ago. Elliot held Luna Naomi, cradled Arya, and between them a picnic basket with apple slices and tiny muffins that still crumbled too easily but were made with unwavering hands. Nearby, an elderly man played the violin's soft aching notes that turned the air into silk. Naomi leaned her head on Elliot's shoulder as the twins watched leaves fall like tiny dancers. "This," she whispered, "is everything I didn't know how to ask for." Elliot didn't speak right away. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something small, an envelope creased at the edges. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Read it." She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter handwritten. "Naomi, we've never done things the traditional way. I loved you before I was brave enough to say it, and you saved me before I knew I needed saving. We made a home out of grief and patience, built something sacred from memory and choice. But today I want to give you something I've been carrying for a long time. I promise to never stop choosing you, even on the days when I'm tired, when we argue about who changed more diapers or who forgot the formula, when life feels heavier than we expected. I promise to listen, to soften, to stay, because you, Naomi Walker, are my peace." She looked up, tears balancing at the edge of her lashes. Elliot reached for her hand, eyes shining. "I'm not asking for a wedding," he said softly. "We don't need another ceremony. I just wanted you to know I'll keep making this choice. Every day, for as long as you'll let me." Naomi didn't speak. She only leaned in, pressed her forehead to his, and let their breath mingle. The violinist shifted to a new song, something light and full of longing. Luna laughed in her sleep. Arya reached toward a drifting leaf and caught it triumphant. Naomi turned to the girls. "One day," she whispered, "they'll ask us how we made it." Elliot followed her gaze. "And we'll tell them slowly, together." That night, after the girls had fallen asleep, Elliot lit another candle, this time beside the bed. Naomi watched him, her heart folding into itself like a secret being spoken aloud. He climbed in beside her, pulled her into his arms. "Still choosing me," she murmured. "Always." Outside their window, the world went on. The traffic moved, the lights blinked, and people rushed to and from lives stitched with distractions. But inside that home built with stitched blankets and sleepless nights with imperfect muffins and perfect devotion, love lived not in the grand gestures, but in the ordinary. In hands that reached in the dark. In letters not written to impress, but to remember. In children born of uncertainty and raised in unwavering care. This is where their story settled. Not with a bang, but with a breath. And in that breath was everything. A love that had lost before and dared to love again. A man who found peace in being needed. A woman who found power in being soft. And two little girls who would grow up wrapped not just in warmth, but in truth. Because real love doesn't arrive loud and unbreakable. It grows slowly. It repairs what cracked. It stays even when it's hard. And if you found even a glimpse of that love in these words, if something in your heart paused, softened, and dared to hope, then this story has done what it was meant to. If this journey moved you, if Naomi and Elliot's love left something lingering in your soul, don't forget to like, share, and follow. Let their quiet vow echo beyond these pages into hearts still waiting to be reminded. Love is worth beginning again. Always.